Hello, folks. This is the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force meeting for October 13th, 2020, starting at 2:30 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website. I am Andrew Held, filling in for Sharon. She's on the phone. Just need someone to fill in for her for a little bit. So I'll be your facilitator for this meeting, and we can get started. Real quickly, we want to do a tour of Blue Jeans as per usual. At the top of your screen, you're going to see 4 options to share your video, share your audio, share your screen, and hang up. You're welcome to share your video. I won't be because you'll just be seeing me staring at another screen for 2.5 hours. Sharing your video, please make sure to mute yourself if you have some background noise, but we welcome live discussion during the task force meeting. The share screen button, no one else should be using but me, so please don't click that. And the hang up button, please click that at the end of the meeting when we're all hang up, but don't do that before then. And then to the right of that, there's the people chat apps and settings. Imagine most folks will be in the chat room. We actually have a pretty good track record of having a lively discussion there, so please feel free to type your thoughts and feelings into the everyone chat box so that we can all see it and react, and we here at DOE definitely use those comments we receive through the chat function after the fact to inform our notes. And then just to call out, if you're having trouble or want to improve your Blue Jeans experience, I'd recommend checking out the settings tab. The fit to view and always show video and layout controls might help improve your Blue Jeans experience. Like I was saying, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website. For any questions and comments throughout the meeting, all attendees have the control of their own mute function, but we might mute you if we hear some background noise, just in case, so that we have a clean, crisp audio throughout the meeting. Task force members, we welcome any comment at any time. Non-task force members, please use the chat box to request to talk, and then we'll call on you to voice your comment. If at this time for attendance, all non-task force members could go ahead in the chat box, register their name and organization, and if it's your first time joining us, your email, so we can add you to our email list and send out updates. And then task force members, we're going to jump into a roll call. So please, as I call on your name, just say here or present as I read off your name. Excuse me. Katie Bergfeld.
Here.
Sweet. Patty Boyd.
Here.
This in the wrong box. Jen Croft is out. Marshall Dewar-Belkin.
Present.
Wendell Felder. Asa Foss, still with DCRA. Is there someone from DCRA on the line? Okay. Dave Good. Max Greninger. Adrian Gross.
Here.
Rush Mahala.
Here.
Jessica Jones.
Here.
Annika, I believe, is out today. Cliff Majerzik. Todd Nedwick.
Here.
Matt Prasky.
Here.
Joe Riley.
Here.
And Jay Wilson.
Here.
Okay, I think we just barely have a quorum. Am I counting that right?
This is Cliff. I'm here.
Oh, hey, Cliff. All right. We are definitely in the clear. Sweet. We can keep on rolling. The role of the task force, which we cover at the beginning of every task force meeting, is just to advise DOE on the creation of an implementation plan for the Building Energy Performance Standard program, recommend amendments to proposed regulations issued by DOE, recommend complementary programs and policies, and then we always state, if a topic needs in-depth discussion, anyone can suggest moving it to a committee or subcommittee. And this is an open meeting to the public. Everyone is allowed and encouraged to participate as we go through the stuff. Our agenda for today. We are going to cover some administrative items, which we just went over. We're going to revisit or finish out our deep energy retrofit pathways conversation. dive into a conversation on prescriptive pathway EEMs, and then we'll have some announcements. And let's get rolling. So I think we covered this in our last meeting, but just to revisit the deep energy retrofit pathways guiding principles. These are DOEE pre-approved ACPs. They'll be available for selection from the get-go. They're designed to provide similar savings as multiple cycles of compliance. Building owners will be able to select them or apply via application at the same time as all other pathways. And then each deep energy retrofit ACP will have its own reporting, evaluation, and enforcement requirements. And just for simplicity's sake, I think have abbreviated deep energy retrofit to DER for the rest of the document, or for the rest of the slide deck. Whoops. And then to go back to our previous conversation, there are sort of two types of DERs we are looking at right now. One is focused on early compliance, which we covered in depth last time, and the other one is extended compliance. And I'll just keep the call out there as people go. We are looking for any suggestions on names that might be preferable or more clear to early or extended. But to dive into each of them, early compliance is designed to incentivize early completion of projects and realize savings sooner. Our current savings targets are compounded savings percentages for multiple cycles, 36%, 48%, 59%. We had an open question about performance for prescriptive options, and then this pathway is open to all property types. And then extended compliance is designed for projects not done within the first cycle to better align with the financing cycles or campus master plans of specific property types. The target will be deeper savings over the course of more than one cycle rather than 20% in consecutive cycles. We'll get into that a little bit later. But then, we're currently proposing only offering this for three sectors: the affordable housing sector, college, university, and hospital campuses. And then I guess I'll say up front, we have talked about having conversations with the college, university, and hospitals, and those conversations are still ongoing. So for right now, we're only going to really be covering the affordable housing side of extended compliance. Okay, let's get into it. So, extended compliance for affordable housing will allow buildings in the sector to target deeper energy savings beyond the base compliance pathways. And, in fitting with that, this is an extension past the three base compliance pathways. And generally, savings will be realized later. So the target will likely be more to make up for the fact that we're not going to be seeing savings as immediate as we would with other pathways. Each building will be required to submit a milestone plan at the beginning of the cycle, and then over the course of time submit progress updates or progress reports at the end of each compliance cycle within their pathway. And then buildings on track will be removed from the pathway and will be subject to aggregated penalties at that time. And as with any other pathway, any progress made will be counted towards reducing that penalty. Okay, so then we want to kind of get everyone's thoughts on the savings targets and timelines we're proposing. So there's currently two options we're thinking of offering. There's a 2-cycle extended compliance option and a 3-cycle one. And the 2-cycle one would be site EUI savings of 40%, and the 3-cycle one would be 60%. And we arrived at these numbers by literally just adding the cycles together, but not compounding them, as sort of I alluded to earlier. How we're viewing these is because savings are not being realized within, the first compliance cycle. Those are avoided. There's like avoided emissions or avoided savings, and so there's this concept of additionality that might need to be realized later down the road to fill in that gap. And so I think first we want to just pause here and see if there's any questions. And first, should we be offering both the 2 and 3 cycle one, or should we only be looking at 2 cycles in advance and see if these numbers make sense?
Hey, Andrew, this is Jay. Are there minimum requirements that these projects would have to meet during the first cycle, such as an energy audit or, basic lighting retrofits or some minimum savings that would start them on a path? Or is this just by the end of the second cycle, cumulatively, they'd have to achieve this benchmark?
Potentially. And Michael, if you want to chime in here also, I think because this is geared towards affordable housing, we kind of wanted to recognize that there might be limited reserves to be doing any sort of work in the interim before they get a refinance, and so that it might not be totally reasonable to ask for that, but it also might be, there might be avenues for them to do those interim goals.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think as with the regular performance path, or like the general performance path, we're looking to make it as flexible as possible. But I think if you all, particularly the affordable housing folks, have a particular opinion about having minimum requirements or milestones in mind, then we can definitely consider incorporating them. But in general, I think we're leaning towards flexibility because then we can catch all the different situations with probably some basic milestones for documenting progress.
Okay. My biggest concern, and it would be helpful to hear the affordable housing folks, their thoughts on it, but my biggest concern is kicking the can down the road and making a decision that may not be well informed at the beginning of multiple cycles, and then having any of these projects get stuck later on and not be able to do what they are intending.
Yeah, I think this is Reshma from DH City. I agree with you, Jay. I think one concern here is, or a couple of concerns, is that these affordable housing projects, if they're making this promise, they're still going to be relying on subsidy to be able to keep that promise, and and subsidy that may or may not be there, or may be competitive, and they might apply for funding and may not get selected, and then I guess there's that question about everything's going to be contingent on them being able to secure the funds to be able to execute this plan, and then the deeper commitment. So if it's going from 20% to 40 to 60, how much additional, what is it going to take to achieve that, and is that achievable? Is it realistic? So I think we just have to think about the potential ramifications if there's some, a lot of projects that are doing this and they're essentially kicking this can down the road and then creating, some additional funding needs that will kind of impact that'll have an impact on the projects that we can fund and the pipeline. So I just think we need to give this some more thought. Curious. Yep.
Well, I was just going to answer Marshall's question from the chat. The question was, can the Green Bank help with funding energy audits? I don't know the answer to that, Marshall, but Donald with the Green Bank may be on today, or
I am here.
Oh, hi. Great.
Hey. To answer the question, just the quick answer is yes, we should be able to fund any of the pre-development processes. We're actually in the process now of putting together a
Did we lose him?
Yeah, we might have lost Donald. While we're waiting for him to come back, I'll quickly answer a question that was asked in the chat. is being kicked off of this pathway automatic, or does it require DOE staff action? And the answer to that is it would require staff action. The whole point of having milestone plans reports in the interim is to kind of keep the conversation going between the building and DOE, and there'll presumably be, numerous opportunities to correct course along the way rather than being removed from the pathway altogether. Our goal here is really compliance, not collecting fines.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounded like Donald before we. Oh, there. Are you back?
Yeah, hey, Donald.
Yes, I'm back. I'm sorry. Did you? I don't know how much you didn't catch.
I think where did you cut off? You started to talk about offerings potential Green Bank was in the process of developing?
Yes. Yeah, so we are in the process right now of developing a product for a pre-development loan. And so working with one of our outside vendors, we would be able to sponsor funding or loan funding for any part of the pre-development process as long as it was going toward the initiative that you would need to put in place. So when we talk about architecture, when we talk about some of the engineering that has to happen, any of the planning, the pre-development loan should be able to cover any of those that you might be looking for up front. I actually have a meeting with the person with the company that we're going to be putting that process together with a little bit later, or at the end of the week. And so from there, we're anticipating just another 3 or 4 weeks before that product's ready to go.
Yeah. Don, the question, that sounds really great. The question I would ask there is, given that it's a loan product, what the sort of goals are for repayment and interest, and also and the time frame in which work should be getting started, because I think the Green Bank funding pre-development is very, very important and fills a crucial need in the market. The challenge is with these buildings, you're talking about a pre-development project for something where the actual project might not happen for another 10 years. And if they're accruing a lot of interest over that time frame, it becomes potentially a challenge, I would think.
Right. Those are a lot of the questions that we have for the vendor that we're working with and partnering with on that. And so I wish I could give you a more solid answer today, but those are still things that we're kind of negotiating at the moment. And so as soon as I have more information that can be shared widely, then I would do that. I know that the payback piece of it we're looking at doing on shorter terms, and so understandable that the projects that you're looking at would be longer term, but the interest rates on them would definitely be very competitive. We just have to kind of figure out what all those pieces look like, and I'll be sure to raise that question when we have our meeting a little bit later this week to see if I can get more information out to the whole group.
Mm-hmm. The other challenge, of course, here is that energy efficiency measures advance quickly, and technology is developing. And if someone's doing a project in 10 years' time and they're not going to get started between now and then, doing an audit now to sort of understand what could be done would be useful. But I would think they wouldn't want to spend too much money and effort on it, because the actual EEMs recommended in a decade's time might be quite different.
Yeah, though, wouldn't it? It does seem like we have to keep in mind here that when we're talking 40 or 60% savings, we're not talking about, hey, you happen to eventually get around to changing out that lighting.
Yeah. It's big stuff.
We're talking about essentially a whole building retrofit.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And so that's gonna look. I mean, there's some broad guidelines of what that would look like, and that won't change too much, potentially, especially if you're looking at electrification. I do wonder if the main issue that would cause a building to need to go for 3 cycles is the inability to do anything for 2 cycles time. I think having a 60% savings goal there is aggressive and is good. I do wonder whether, to what extent. I mean, if it's site energy and then electrifying, it might be they might well be able to do it. But I worry about the sort of the need. These buildings need to, if they really cannot do anything sooner because of their financing constraints, then I think asking them to go deeper is appropriate. But how much deeper is a function of also what they what they're sort of. They're not going to pick 3 cycles because they want to go 60%. They're going to pick 3 cycles because they can't do 2 cycles, for example.
Well, I wonder if I think that does sound like a reasonable concern that, if it's not until a 3rd cycle out and we're talking 12 plus years from now. But on the flip side, it does sort of it would seem like it would be appropriate for DOEE to provide a 3rd cycle of confirmed compliance if someone hit a 60% reduction.
Yes.
Right? So, I don't just trying to draw that distinction a little bit.
No, that's valid.
Matt, sorry, can you just tease that point out so I understand it properly? Is like if they
so to Marshall's concern is appropriate that presumably under a 3 cycle waiver, someone not getting started, and who knows what the landscape is in 12 years from now, right? But so to say guarantee 3 cycles from the beginning seems risky. But on the flip side, if someone did end up achieving 60% reduction, it seems appropriate to give them 3 cycles worth of guaranteed compliance.
And yeah, that gets back to the conversation we were having in the last meeting about the early compliance path being something that both could be applied for, but also could be sort of granted if people are shooting beyond.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. These can also slide up and down, kind of like how we're thinking with the extended or the early compliance. I really quickly want to get back to the initial requirements and just highlight a point Cliff was making in the chat about if the owner already has a robust capital plan, DOE should waive an audit requirement. Cliff, is there anything else you want to expand on that before we move forward?
Yeah, I think if they have a capital plan, they have it funded, it was prepared by a 3rd party or reviewed by a 3rd party, it's robust, then I don't think you should require an audit. I think your attitude is appropriately so. You want to make sure the work is going to get done and minimize the paperwork.
Okay.
This is Todd.
I think that's where I want to add in that if we're talking about 40 or 60% savings in a whole building retrofit, essentially, or something that's substantial, is an incremental level 1 energy audit done in year 1 of that really adding any value? So just trying to I'm cautioning what is being required in terms of like the early incremental work. If in reality, the plan is 8-10 years from now, we're totally retrofitting these building systems. Audit done in year 1 or 2 doesn't really contribute to the whole thing.
Matt, I think we are losing you slightly. But to that point, then, if an ASHRAE level 1 in year 1 is not appropriate, would it be more appropriate to ask for 2 or 3, or potentially, the interim milestone plans being additional audits?
So I don't think it's the level of audit. Sorry, this is Kate. I think it's the point that if you're retrofitting, doing a whole building retrofit and swapping out all of your systems, an audit isn't going to tell you very much because that's looking at the existing building. So requiring people to pay for an ASHRAE level 2 audit when they're going to do a whole building retrofit or repositioning seems unnecessary.
Got it.
Well, you're going to learn from an energy model on the new building more than what you would learn from an audit of the existing building.
Yeah.
One potential hook.
I think Todd was going to chime in too. I don't want to lose that Todd in the queue.
Yeah, it's a kind of a different issue, but just returning to that question of the competitiveness of the subsidies and thinking through what kind of flexibility there might be if an owner is committing to achieving, a deeper savings, but then that subsidy is not available. I'm just curious if there have been, I think that's an important issue to kind of think through, and I don't want to lose that, that question there.
So, returning to what Kate said, I do think that one of the real concerns is that a building owner might get extended compliance for 3 cycles and then sort of forget about it, or at least some of the people involved in the building might forget about it, and then a furnace dies or something like that, and they replace it with a similar furnace that's clearly not going to be in keeping with their agreement pursuant to this extended compliance pathway. And I'm wondering if there's some measures that can be taken to guard against that. What you really don't want is people investing in equipment that is, they're going to have to tear it out before the end of its useful life. If there's something related to building permitting or something, I realize that often equipment can be replaced like for like without a building permit, which presents a challenge. But I think that's a big part of what we want to guard against, that they're really planning for it, that they realize that they know how long their equipment's going to last, and they're making plans to replace the equipment before it needs to be replaced on an emergency basis in a way that's in keeping with the kind of deep retrofits that they're going to need to do to achieve their commitment.
I do think, Cliff, that gets to sort of part of our intent for having milestone check-ins along the way, so that if, a system is expected to be at end of life, that's reported and acknowledged from DOE's staff point of view, and then that can be serve as the reminder as the interim. Does that kind of get to your concern there?
I think it does, as long as there's the systems in place. Just because EE knows about it doesn't necessarily mean that someone on site in a building is going to know about it. And is there anything else that we can do to make sure that there's a plan in place, that when that boiler or whatever is scheduled to be replaced, and even if their mortgage isn't going to be for 10 years, they don't end up replacing their boiler in 5, kind of thing.
I mean, for the affordable housing folks on phone, in that sort of situation, can the building where the boiler breaks, they need to put in a new boiler, and they can get funding for that separately, right? And that could be above like base code. They could, if they knew the energy from their energy audit or other plans that they were going to eventually be putting in a much more efficient boiler, couldn't they then know that they should, and maybe DOE or the SCU helps hold them accountable for actually going and doing that portion of the work now? And now, as in when it breaks.
I mean, it would be coming out of their replacement reserves, right? Like there's no additional funding mechanism.
Yeah.
That would be coming. So it'd be coming out of the replacement reserve. So if it's something that's being replaced mid-cycle, yeah, you would expect them to be wanting there'd have to be a mechanism for DOE to hold them accountable for it, but it'd be funded from reserves.
Mm-hmm. And those
that are typically approved by the investor in the deal, right, or the investor or the lender, like whoever's holding those reserves. They have to be approved for use.
Well, and my understanding is that the lender can be ultimately, since the lender a mortgage lender has the title as recourse on their loan, ultimately they can be accountable for any fines or whatever on the property that would encumber their ownership in the event that they had to foreclose. And so they can require that the borrower do things to protect them against that liability. So maybe part of this is just educating the lenders, making sure each lender, mortgage lender, knows about an extended compliance agreement for a particular property and knows that they should not say, approve replacement with a equipment that's incompatible with that extended compliance agreement.
It may be a little trickier with this structure because it's the investor that I think is the logical point, not necessarily the lender.
It depends
And
on the project.
yeah,
It depends on
but I think it's
they're not
both.
the same for each.
Right.
But maybe
Yeah.
we could build in some sort of a requirement that lenders and investors need to be notified prior, at the beginning of the extended compliance process, so that they can know that, track it as part of their regular tracking of their investment or their loan.
Yeah, I don't know how enthusiastic they will be about adding an additional requirement that erodes their collateral, but yes, I think they'll want to be involved. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Just a question, this is Reshma for DOE. What's your thinking in terms of the percentage of affordable housing projects that would take advantage, like pursue this path? Like, if you could talk a little bit more about your thinking around this is an option and how many projects you'd expect to pursue this.
Yeah, this is Michael. I think I was thinking this would generally only apply to projects that are already on or planning to be on a finance cycle. So whether that's a 4% or 9% tax credit project, or I believe Section 8 also has similar kind of time frames. So I don't think it's going to be the majority of projects. Yeah.
As we think about the realism of these percentages, can some of you remind us there is also, unlike for other sectors, affordable housing can get an extension of compliance for longer than the 3 years, right? So they could, is that anticipated potentially to be up to 3 cycles if it's necessary? And if so, what becomes the incentive to do this in the first place? If you could just say, I just want an extension.
So I think, and Michael, feel free to chime in here if I'm off base, but we talked previously about the extensions having additional requirements, and so it might actually look very similar to this on the extension side for affordable housing, and then the difference is really kind of moot. It's just whether you're selecting at the beginning that you're doing this versus whether after the first cycle you're requesting it.
Okay.
Well, this is Kate. I think the other distinction is that extension would require demonstrating some hardship too,
yes.
As the legislation lays out. Whereas the deep energy retrofit, you could pursue this path regardless of whether or not you would be challenged in meeting the compliance obligation in the first cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we've talked about with the delay of compliance in this group. I know it's been mentioned in previous meetings that either it would come with conditions to get that delay of compliance, or you would just be subject to the BEPS when it comes up. So let's say you're a project and you ask for a 2-year delay of compliance, which gets you into 2028. I'm just making up numbers here. Nobody take that as you may. But we're going to be setting the next BEPS by 2027. So that building would get that delay of compliance, but then we would also be evaluating whether to see if they had met the BEPS for 2027. And if they are, they're going to be placed in a compliance cycle again, right? And have other requirements they're going to have to meet. So with an affordable housing project, if we do it that way, they might get to cycles, they might ask for a 10-year extension, but there's going to be more BEPS set in that 10 years. And so we're going to have to ensure that they're, at that point, we're going to also evaluate the property when we set that new BEPS and see if they're meeting it. And so it's either, sort of taking that, for me, it seems like it's either taking that more uncertain path where it's like, yeah, I could ask for this 10-year extension, but there's uncertainty in that 10 years of whether I'm going to be told that I have another set of requirements to meet, or I can try to do sort of the work up front and take this extended compliance pathway that could be approved by DOEE and kind of know what my beginning is and what my end is and just sort of follow that pathway along the way. That's where I see the difference there, Marshall.
That's helpful. I think the other thing I would encourage as DOE is working with buildings here, and you're thinking about this, is that the percentages. I think one reason people are challenged to say, I work in the energy efficiency sector. You'd think I could say, X percentage is right, but the problem is, of course, it's all relative and based on the building. We're not dealing with absolute EUIs here. The average multifamily building has a site EUI of 52, something like that. I forget what the DC average is, but that's national. A net zero energy multifamily building would be around 20, and so if that EUI if their EUI now is like 65, then a 60% reduction is a net zero energy retrofit. If their EUI is like 120, it's just become a typical building. It means a very different thing in terms of what's required based on the baseline and the starting point. And I think that is easy for people to see when they're thinking about, whether I take the standard target pathway or go for the performance path or go for a deep energy retrofit, and they're making that choice. It's harder for an individual building that knows where they are. It's harder in the abstract.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Marshall. And I think Andrew sort of explained this, but the idea of the 40-60 was that these savings are going to be delayed, right? So we're allowing the savings to be delayed, so we're going to require a bit more out of the property that's asking for that delay, essentially. But I hear what you're saying in terms of it being very relative to the building.
As another thing to think about, I guess, to loop in Todd and Reshma's point to this discussion too. We talked last time about amending the QAP and the RFP to have additional higher stepped up levels that projects would have to meet. All of these projects are most likely, if they're taking this option, going to be forced into this competitive funding round that may have a even higher standard now because it'll be 2 or 3 years from now. So it may be that sort of gets wiped out. It's not really 60%. It's whatever the funding requirement is from the QAP and the RFP. So I think there is sort of a floating scale here. It's more what you're committing to do a deep retrofit, and however deep it is will be based on not only the percentage here, but also whatever we're going to require as part of the QAP and the RFP.
And John, I'd encourage you then when you're thinking about that to the point we were just making here, to think about, especially in the context of major retrofits or new construction, to think about absolute EUI targets as well as just percentage reductions as the district is trying to get towards a net zero energy, code and so forth, to start thinking about what do absolute targets look like.
Marshall, this is Kate. That's a really good idea and aligns with what we're thinking of in terms of the milestones we need to hit with each code cycle. Although I guess I would have to think about how we would adjust those for a retrofit scenario rather than thinking about it from new construction. But that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get too off this topic, but I do want to kind of ask an accompanying question that's parallel to this is, we envision this as a pathway for affordable housing based on problems we saw with their capital improvement cycles. And, obviously we're talking with college and universities and hospitals for kind of the similar reasons, but do folks on the task force foresee any other building sectors that might fall into the same kind of bucket of constraints that might benefit from a longer term pathway?
Yes. I envision any number of owners of primarily Class B or C properties, anyone with single property owners, or condo associations that could all kind of have the same criteria as you're talking about with affordable housing.
Public projects might be in this bucket as well, just given capital improvement plans and funding availability.
Mm.
Although with public projects, the district, if they're district-owned buildings, the district has an extra responsibility to provide the resources needed so that they can comply with the district's own climate commitments and district's own BEPS. But yeah, I mean, I think there can be a little space between what should happen and what does happen.
I agree with you 100%, Cliff.
Okay, I was seeing other seconds in the chat for condos, co-ops.
So, Mark, the condos co-ops would be, so when we're referring to affordable housing, that at least limited equity co-ops would be included, but do you mean even like all condos, not just affordable?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I'll give my building as an example. We're definitely a market rate co-op, and the units are anywhere from 300,000 to 750,000. But because we have people that bought in the building in the 70s and the 80s, we have a lot of older fixed income residents here, that any sort of additional monthly cost is going to impact their ability to live, and so we're very careful of that. And so we're also looking at a deep building energy retrofit, replacing almost all of the building's major systems, and that's going to take years, right? So having the option of starting the planning now, but maybe delivering those incentives, maybe in a 10-year period, would be better for the pocketbooks, but also less potentially intrusive into the lives of the building occupants if we're sort of forced to cram like a whole bunch of majorly disruptive projects into 3 or 4 years.
Got it. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, that's helpful. Any other property types, maybe anything outside of the traditional office multifamily sectors? Or any blind spots we might have within there? Sorry,
retail serving disinvested communities. Obviously, retail is already hurting, and a mixed-use building with ground floor retail, there could be some financing challenges, and there can be some equity impacts if you can't provide flexibility to enable them to continue to serve their community.
Totally, and to clarify also, this isn't to take away from traditional delay of compliance criteria that we are building out to also potentially service those types of properties. Those will still definitely be available. Any other points before we want to move on? I'll make another call for other names besides early compliance and extended compliance. If you have any, just drop them in the chat. Hearing none. Why don't we move on to our next topic? Prescriptive pathway. We want to, one second, sorry. So we were planning on going into more detail with the efficiency measures, but as for everyone's context, we have extended the cost benefit study grant. And so our research really isn't at a point where we want to discuss it with the task force. So, right now we want to review the guiding principles, and we have 2 questions we want to pose to the prescriptive path on the prescriptive pathway to the task force, and then we'll revisit the conversation on individual EEMs later down the road once we have a little bit more information from our grantee on that. But we do want to dive into these questions and then also talk about the guiding principles, which I actually can't remember if we've shared before, but to just quickly go over them at a high level. We're here to utilize industry-proven methods and tools as a framework to provide specific guidance through the prescriptive pathway. We want to ensure that requirements are, obtainable, realistic, and cost-effective, and they drive innovation by incentivizing deep savings per measure. And we want to build out a robust reporting and verification requirements to ensure accountability and transparency, ensure that the program aligns with other district plans and incentives, and address equity components across the BEPS program. And then we want to get into 2 questions for today. First one is on retrocommissioning and the prescriptive pathway, and then we have a question on methodology for determining the goal of the prescriptive pathway, expected versus realized, and determining EEM values. So we wanted to dive into that a little bit. And so let's dive into the retrocommissioning conversation. So we've definitely talked this before a couple times without resolution. And so we generally have an idea of what we'd like to initially propose and get feedback on. So generally we've seen some, I wouldn't call them issues, but some gray areas when it comes to retrocommissioning. Namely, there's a wide savings range, 5 to 30%. We've definitely heard stories of it being difficult to verify. Other cities have entire programs dedicated to reporting and enforcing retrofits. Seattle, I think Philly has one, New York. DOE's thoughts on retrocommissioning at a whole building level for the prescriptive pathway. There are mandatory measures we could have that kind of cover this in a light fashion, so a robust O&M plan. We could also this is our proposal. I'm sorry, I got tripped up. So this is our thought on what we would offer for the prescriptive pathway for retrocommissioning. Basically, it would be a mandatory measure to develop and implement a robust O&M plan of retrocommissioning light, and there would be no savings percentage values associated with it. And so I think we wanted to get a sense of how people felt about this. First of all, whether or not it should be a mandatory measure, and thoughts on, given the uncertainty of a value, should we offer a value towards this measure? And then tangentially, how do we enforce this or report this? And for non-task force members, if you want to leave comments in the chat, we will accept those as well.
My first reaction is that as retrocommissioning can be one of the more cost-effective measures, it seems somewhat unfair or sort of at odds with the sort of goals of BEPS in general to not award points for implementing.
Okay, noted. To kind of draw on that, I guess, does anyone have any thoughts about how those could be reported and verified by DOE?
Well, I don't have. Maybe this is a question for some folks with slightly more technical expertise, but if the percentage savings scales in some sense to the scope of what is being commissioned, it would seem appropriate then for a building to report the scope of what's being commissioned and scale the available points accordingly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you commissioning just a chiller or a piece of base building equipment versus we're commissioning controls system, the building automation system, or the commissioning will include all terminal units, VAVs, fan coil boxes, or fan coil units, or so forth, right? And so if there's a way to indicate how much of the building or the building systems are being commissioned, would, at least in theory, have some correlation to the amount of savings that could be identified and realized. But I'm somewhat speculating there.
And if there are folks on the phone who actually do retro commissioning on the regular, which I will admit for the record that I do not do, I think for this to your point, it's sort of the same thing as the percentage reduction. It's really a question of your baseline. You know, if your system, as Annika said previously, I don't remember if it was in a past meeting or in some other conversation, but you know, if your building is really, really badly performing, then you're going to get a 30%. Maybe you can get a 30% savings on retro commissioning. But if it's not doing a lot, it's if your building's already okay, it's not going to deliver as much savings, and it's much a function of sort of what your current conditions are than sort of which systems are being looked at. As a general principle, I feel like if for any measure where the range of savings doesn't go down to zero, at the very least, the minimum of the range should be offered. That's sort of my 2 cents. That doesn't really help you with your how to verify question, but.
Yeah, if I can.
There. Oh, God, Katie.
Yeah, I think what we're also struggling with on our end, and it's not just that the savings are wide range, and it's that, the idea of like the whole industry of retro commissioning, there's not really like standards that we can point to say, this is exactly how you need to be doing your retro commissioning, and this is the documentation, and this is what needs to happen, because it's done very differently from what we understand across the industry. And so from our standpoint, it's very hard for us to build out standards for retro commissioning for this program without already having an industry standard to point to. And so I think that's another thing that we're sort of struggling with. And Christian, I don't know if you want to add to it, because I know you've done some thinking on this as well.
Yeah. For context, like Seattle's tune-up law, for instance, which is basically retro commissioning, they have a very robust, system set up. They have like 10 people on their team. It took like 3 years to develop it, and have very specific requirements for the commissioning agent and kind of the audit. And they have to audit 20 systems, and there's 10 mandatory systems that they have to retro commission if they're seeing them performing subpar, and then the other 10 would be optional for the building owner. So it took a long time to set up. It's very hard to regulate. And then they're seeing a vast difference of different agents that are working. So there's kind of a tendency towards a race to the bottom, people to kind of do the minimum amount required to just report and not actually get the best savings out of it or the best product for their client. And kind of, they're definitely struggling with that out there, I know, with kind of regulating that in that way can be very difficult to do, and there does tend to be a big race to the bottom. It's very hard to set up all those standards yourself. There isn't like a national standard for that. It's just, I realize there's a ton of savings available there. I think maybe when people get an audit and they see all the different potential in their building, they switch to the performance pathway and say, well, we're just going to think we can do 17% on retro commissioning alone, and then we can eke out the rest of the 3% on some, other retrofits here or there, normally planned CapEx stuff. So I think everyone in our office definitely realizes that there is a huge amount of potential there. It's just regulating it fairly that I think is a real challenge.
I accept that, and I think that makes quite a bit of sense. And if essentially the messaging around the prescriptive path is more to do with basically saying the intention of if you intend to attempt to comply through operational savings measures, retro commissioning and so forth, then the performance path is more appropriate for you, and the prescriptive path is for equipment changes or upgrades, then I guess that does make more sense.
And I think that's where we had I remember a while ago when we first talked about the prescriptive path, we talked about the idea that prescriptive path was going to be all capital measures, and if you wanted to do O&M, you needed to, that was what the performance path was for. So that would align with that. But we do want people to have robust plans to maintain their equipment that they're putting in, or the equipment they already have, which is, so, I don't know. Maybe I'm becoming persuaded. As much as I like
that's what we're trying to come at with this proposal is we want to include some form of O&M plan on the prescriptive pathway. We just don't know if that, O&M measure is retro commissioning. Christian, correct me if I'm wrong.
So yeah, I mean, we're planning on having a fairly robust O&M plan, but then also documentation of implementation of that plan during the cycle. So they would actually have to, it's not going to catch everything that a full retro commissioning would, but at least some of the major set points and some of the more egregious and easily findable O&M items should be identified and corrected within that process.
Hi there, this is Patty from DCSU. I just wanted to add that I don't know how you would verify without looking at the data and being able to do that. So, in our standard prescriptive measures at the DCSU, retro commissioning is not something that we do. But in the Pay for Performance program, it is. And the Pay for Performance program allows us to look at actual data to see, the difference in energy use, hopefully reduction. In addition to seeing the data reduction, we also have to have all of this evidence for the items that they've done or the measures that they've done. And we keep track of both of those things. And it is, it's time consuming. So, just telling them to do it, I agree, the race to the bottom. I appreciate that statement. I'm not sure how you would verify it, how DOE would verify it. So I just want to echo that.
Hey guys, it's Joe Riley. I guess I would kind of look at it like this, right? If you are willing to accept, non-capital measures as part of the prescriptive path, right? Which I've advocated. I think it kind of should be for big ticket things. But if you're going to put some of these, O&M type things or soft cost type things or things that it's hard to ascribe the value to or verify, I think that's addressed with your, the rule that if you don't make it on your prescriptive path on the first try, right, you've lost that gate, for the next try, right? Like I think you kind of have to be at peace that some amount of the things that you're requiring are going to be pretty tough to measure and verify. Like, you just kind of get a report at the end, saying that this has been done or a paid invoice or something of that. And it is going to be a race to the bottom to some extent, but I think that's the risk you take when you include some of those measures. And it's just, you do have a backup plan in place to account for that.
Yeah.
And I'm looking through some retro commissioning we did. I thought there was a standard, like an ASTM, or ASHRAE or something. So I'm clicking around trying to find you a standard here. I thought there was one, but I'm sure you all know better than me.
Any other thoughts we want to have on retro commissioning before we move forward a little bit?
I'm going to say one last thing, and I'll shut up. But I'm not sure if I'm agreeing or disagreeing with Joe here, because I'm not entirely But I think that having a robust O&M plan and documenting that you've done that, yes, you're right, that the sort of the fallback of, oh, you didn't get your savings, so you can't do the prescriptive path next time, does that. But we also want to set people up for success. That should be a fallback. That should be, oh no, something has gone wrong, as opposed to something that happens to a ton of buildings. Because if it happens to a ton of buildings, the prescriptive path itself is going to come in for some real questions. So I think that having some requirements that you do proper O&M on both your existing equipment and new equipment, I think is an important part of setting people up for success, even if savings can't be attributed to it. And I think that Patty's point on the analog for the DCSCU is forgive me, Patty, to oversimplify, but your pay for performance is the performance path, and your incentives are the prescriptive path. So, sort of seems to track there.
Yep, agreed, Marshall.
Good points. I do want to give credit to Mark's comment in the chat of lack of knowledge of the retrocommissioning process among part of the industry, and I think that also maybe raises a concern for at least me. I'm not sure how the rest of the team feels about this, but the idea that we'd have to pair any sort of retrocommissioning measure with probably extensive education, as well as build out an entire enforcement and verification process, seems like just adding to the daunting call of having this on the prescriptive pathway. So maybe, yeah, Marshall, more in line with what you're saying. Okay, why don't we move on to individual energy efficiency measure weightings examples. And so I want to say that this is a busy slide. I'm going to read through it, and then we have some questions on the next slide that we want to talk about. But so here we have two different measures, examples. We have an office lighting retrofit, and we have a retrofit of a rooftop unit. And so I'm not going to read each of the descriptions, but switching some T5s to LEDs, and then converting a constant lighting system to VFD, or variable flow system, sorry. And what we're seeing in both these cases is, for office lighting fit, there's a really tight but low expected savings, and from the rooftop unit, there's wide amount of savings, and they're actually pretty large, so 22 to 90% energy consumption savings, 57% average. And there's a lot of reasons behind where you see this variability. And I'm not going to go into each of these, but we have a lot of variables that are causing this range here. And so what we want to get into is, for each of these examples, like how do we actually ascribe a point value to each of these measures, given the wide variance in savings versus the actual underlying reasons for those differences. And so we have a couple questions we want to dive into here. The first is, and I can scroll back and forth if people want to look more, but the first question is, like, if expected savings is more than, or the range is more than 5 points, should we be offering the measure on the prescriptive pathway? And I think we want to say 5 points is, consider that almost like an X or a question mark. We're not super certain on what the threshold should be, but is there a threshold by which we should no longer consider the measure appropriate for the prescriptive pathway is sort of our first question we want to ask the group.
Andrew, just to clarify, and I really appreciate you pulling together those examples of those variances previously. When we were looking at that, the rooftop units with that 22 to 90%, just to make clear, that's 22 to 90% of rooftop unit energy consumption, not building level energy consumption, whereas the 2 to 6% is building level savings, right?
Correct, Marshall.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a hard time finding an
Totally
example.
fine. Just wanted to make sure that everyone understood what they were looking at because they are so different in their numbers.
Correct.
And that 22 to 90% range is going to be much smaller in the context of a whole building. It'll still be substantial, but
Well,
it's
and
small.
depending on the size of the unit and the size of what kind of controls it has or those kind of things, it could be, let's say, 10 to 20%.
Yeah,
Or something
it's
like,
not,
which would be larger than the 4% difference on the top.
but smaller than the 70% difference shown there.
Correct.
I'm not sure who made this point earlier, but for the prescriptive points, should we be assuming values near the bottom of the range? And then if they get savings more near the top of the range, then they can comply using the performance path.
I think that's definitely one way we've looked at it, Cliff. The other thought is to just take the median or average point in the range. Just assume that there's both cases. I don't know if other folks have thoughts on that, whether we should be more conservative with our point value in these cases, or should we exclude them altogether?
I mean, this is where I think back to the amount, to what was laid out a few meetings ago in terms of what's required to be in the prescriptive path. And given that that was somewhat robust, it feels to me like, to an extent, by going through all that to confirm that folks have done, put in a strong effort, it seems to me like on this, DOEE has to take some of the risk in terms of delivering the outcomes, right? Like, to somewhat penalize the respondent to an extent, given the amount going in of work, as we sort of said, through each of those 4 phases of the process. Seems somewhat unfair, or I don't know. That's just my gut reaction to limiting either the savings credit awarded or limiting the number of measures available.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'll just
Matt,
say I've seen these kinds of savings in my own work, these large ranges in my own work as well. It goes back to the point we're sort of saying all the time. It's all about what your baseline is, right? My feeling on it is that, yeah, I think that it's where there's a huge range. I think going towards the bottom of the range is probably safer. And where there's not a huge range, like that lighting example, going more in the median, I think makes sense. Now, where you draw that exact line between, we're going to assume the bottom of the range, we're going to assume the median, I think may vary. But I think I said this earlier in the context of something else entirely. But so long as the bottom of the range isn't 0 and it's a capital measure, I think it can be included. It's just a question of. But I think that sort of idea of, if it's more than X%, should we offer the measure? I would reframe that if it's more than X%, maybe that's where you look at more of the bottom of the range than the median, if it's a smaller range. Especially since if you're going to take the bottom in every case, a lot of these are going to be ranges of 1 or 2% to like 5%, and if every one of those only gets to be 1 or 2%, it's going to make it a lot harder to add up to 20. So.
No, that's a good point.
Andrew, what if we did a little quick kind of vote in the chat box and say either bottom of the range or median? Just kind of your initial thoughts. We won't take this as a vote.
The master facilitator has spoken, folks. Yeah, if folks would write in the chat box what they'd prefer, we can take this a mini survey.
Yeah, certainly there would be other options here too, as kind of a compromise of like the 40th percentile or something like that, as kind of a halfway between the two, or 35th percentile, something like that.
Do you have distribution? Are you expecting to get those actual distributions, or are you just sort of saying 40th percentile is 40% of the distance between the two? Because if you have those distributions, that's a lot. That makes it a lot better.
We will not have those distributions. We'll have expected percentage savings.
I can dream.
And hopefully for context here, hopefully we can have for many of the EMs kind of steps, like interim steps of different efficiencies or different percentage of lights retrofitted, et cetera, such that you can kind of parse out the different levels of savings that building would see, so that you wouldn't have that wide range anymore. So hopefully we can kind of put some guide rails and steps within the EMs to mitigate this as much as possible. But there certainly will be some there that just inherently have a wider range due to the unknown factors of that building.
Christian, this is Kate. I have a follow-up question to that, because I was going to suggest that if there's sort of an if-then structure almost, because I think some of the range has to do with the starting point and the current building. So is there a possibility for, like on lighting, you would get the higher end of the points based on, how inefficient your current lighting is? I know that would be more complicated, but it seems like that would be one way to maybe account for what you were describing.
Yeah, hopefully we can do that as much as possible. There won't be an infinite amount of possibilities there, but there's going to be, hopefully different levels on the starting point for certain items. How bad were your original windows before you replaced them, and how good are the windows you're putting in? It starts getting very complicated very quickly. What's your window to wall area ratio? What's your wall to square footage ratio? All these things matter in that savings ratio. When you start adding like 4 different if-thens, it starts to get really complicated. So we have to kind of cut it off at some point as well to make it reasonable to actually get those numbers somewhat accurate.
I wonder if the key distinction there is if we're able to know the nature of what leads to the range of outcomes, is it a equipment variables of sort of what it was before and what it may be after, or is it like behavioral, right? Like the question on some of the lighting was like, well, you get these savings if people work more hours, or if the thing after it's installed is operated as intended. And knowing which of those two categories it falls into leads to sort of different thinking on whether to give more of the benefit of the doubt to the range or not.
I'm not sure it makes as much difference in a commercial building context. We're using the term alternative compliance payment to make it easier for the landlord to pass through to its commercial tenants. And if it's an occupancy problem, that's really falling to the commercial tenants, and we're trying to make it so that they have skin in the game to improve the building's performance.
I mean, should we be in a place here where we say that here's the default points available, but if you as the building respondent or the person complying can demonstrate X in terms of why the savings allocated for this measure should be higher, then it can be approved?
I mean, I think certainly if they can actually demonstrate that there was higher energy savings, which may be hard, especially if they're doing lots of different things at the same time,
No, I'm not saying after the fact. I'm saying in advance. You're saying, we default to providing, 4 points for changing out rooftop units, but if in doing an energy audit or model or some sort of documentation around it, we're able to say, yes, but the scope of this is such that we expect 10 or 15 or 20% savings, then award more points as part of the prescriptive path. But still prescriptive in advance, not in demonstrating those savings after the fact. Or in other words, essentially doing a more site-specific and condition-specific study to validate the potential savings than the cost-benefit analysis is able to do, because that's all generalized.
So that would be more in line with like an ASHRAE level 3 audit, and then the baselining your building and tweaking the baseline to get it correct for your existing energy usage can be quite tricky in order to get an accurate projected savings, from what I understand. But it's certainly an option. It's just a lot more uncertainty around that, and then more regulation and verifying of those energy models and the baselines.
I think if you're going to do the work of paying for that kind of level of energy modeling, you're going to be taking the performance path, I would think.
So Marshall, thanks for bringing that up, because I've noticed that point kind of coming up a couple times, and it's just like I want to kind of get back to, like, I thought the spirit of the prescriptive pathway was to help. In my mind, it was always to just give certainty, right? That it's like, hey, if you're not sure, right, like when you're underwriting a building, because we don't want to start off, DC being a worldwide, kind of a place where people invest, that they need to be able to, before they have the intimate knowledge of the building and they're thinking about buying it, to underwrite improvements to get in compliance, and that they can have to pencil this, right? And so the reason that someone chooses to go prescriptive isn't because they know that the X, A, B, or C can get them to 20%. They just know it because they're reading the prescriptive path, and here's the menu of things, and I know how much those things cost to do, so I can proceed knowing that I've got a prescriptive path to be in compliance with this law. I don't need to be afraid of doing business in the district, right? It's not because you know how to do efficiency or not. It's just because you can know with certainty you can be in conformance, right? It's not to teach people how to do it. Like, that's what the hub's going to do. The Green Building Hub's going to teach people that need help, and it's not to. Yeah, I guess I don't mean to just completely whine. I feel like the more we kind of make the prescriptive pathway uncertain, it's just like that. I think it's defeating the point, and I think it served a good purpose, at the very beginning.
I think, Joe, that's a good point, and kind of gets to how Christian has kind of spelled it out as more of a compromise between, maybe taking away all the risk from the building owner and putting on DOE, and putting risk back on the building. If you know your baseline, we can give kind of a variable scale while still providing that, I don't know what you call it, risk mitigation, certainty, probably a better term. Do you feel like that's kind of in line still with what you envisioned it to be?
Yeah, no, I do. I feel like, Christians thought, if it's, it's depending on what your baseline is and how many points you could receive for these these various improvements, like that all makes sense to me. But yes, that makes sense. Like, I think you want to be like you should be able to try to reasonably be able to pencil this ahead of time, how much it's going to cost to comply, and then I've got a prescriptive path.
Yeah. I think also then to kind of close out the other point is like, Matt, we can maybe consider those things as part of custom ACP in some way if someone wants to test out doing an ASHRAE level 3 audit and modeling out what the savings were for the prescriptive pathway. Maybe that's something we can consider as part of an ACP.
Yeah, true. And I think in general, it's just kind of hard to talk about this until we see more on the full list of measures. Until we're able to see what do potential compliance paths look like to get to 20 points. Like if it's the bottom of the range for all these things, is it necessarily the case to look at the menu of options and see, wow, even at replacing windows and replacing a chiller and this still only does that get us there? Or, I don't know, until we can see some more specifics of point values alongside the list of potential measures. I think that's kind of critical here.
Yeah, and I'm just going to remind, from the DOE perspective, we are being tasked with creating a prescriptive pathway for, hundreds of buildings in the district that we can effectively enforce and we can effectively verify. And so that is where a lot of our decision making comes from as well, Joe, is I hear you on the certainty point, but we also on our end have to have certainty that it's being implemented correctly and that we're able to verify it and we're able to enforce it. Because what we don't want, and I think pretty much everyone on the phone, I keep saying phone these days, computer, some of you might be on a phone, pretty much everyone on the line I think can agree is that what we don't want here is a loophole. We don't want to be creating a loophole whereby people are able to sort of skate by the intent and the idea behind this legislation and these regulations. And so I hear you on the certainty, but from our standpoint, it's also really important that we're creating a pathway that, again, we can measure, we can track, we can verify, we can enforce from our standpoint. And so save me having 50 more staff members, there are certain things that, are going to have to be done a certain way from our standpoint because we cannot effectively enforce or verify things like certain things and actually make this an effective pathway that will get people sort of on the same track and towards meeting the BEPS as a building taking the performance pathway, right? So we're trying to also create certainty that they're going to be making more progress towards meeting the BEPS so that they're not constantly caught in this cycle. And so that's another standpoint that we're coming from on our ends, is making sure that we're providing that proper guidance and providing the measures that people can take to help them get further along the line as buildings that are on a performance pathway.
Totally. No. You can't create, this whole big giant program and then have a loophole that everyone can just squeeze through like that. That makes all the sense in the world. Can I stick on that point for a second then? With the prescriptive path, given the requirements, to measure and verify, right, and confirm and, regulate, why include nebulous things that are tough to measure and verify in the prescriptive path, like retrocommissioning, right? If the point is to lead people, it's because we want to tell people hey, creating a good O&M plan is a really important step. And we think that, good people, people should be doing that and maintaining their equipment and having a plan. Well, I think that's what the Green Building Hub is going to do, is teach people how to do things, right? If I were you, I wouldn't want to ascribe any points to anything that's paperwork related. I want to ascribe points to like things that you do your paper, homework, and then you spend some money and put some improvements in, and that's how I know because that's a lot easier to measure and verify when I see the receipt. When it's like here's the the shipping information for the the invoices for the consultants that spent time on the site, or mechanical people who installed things, or windows that were like that's the proof. I can measure and verify that. It's just like, so what's your rationale there?
You're saying what's our rationale for making it be a more robust O&M plan rather than a retro?
No, yeah, well, just like the retro commissioning, like it's going to be required, but like no points, or or we think it's really hard to put points to. It's like, well, if we think it's hard to put points to because we're not sure if it's going to save things, well, maybe it shouldn't be on the prescriptive path, and we should only have prescriptive path be things that we're confident in the point values, and we're confident that we can measure and verify them.
I think that's what we were proposing on the.
Oh, okay. Well, then I agree. Sorry.
So that slide where we talked about retro commissioning, can you go back to it, Andrew? Yeah. So if you look at the third bullet down, sort of our thoughts are that actually instead of having point value assigned to retro commissioning, we'd have more of a retro commissioning light. Where there'd be sort of a robust O&M plan that the building owner would have to submit to say sort of how they're going to, meet sort of specific aspects of O&M. But Christian, I don't know if you want to give any more details on that, but that was sort of our viewpoint.
No, Joe, I think that's exactly what we were proposing here. We recognize the value that something nebulous like retro commissioning can bring to a lot of buildings, but because of that, the nature of that, we're probably planning on taking things like that off.
Okay, sorry, I guess I was confused. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
No, we appreciate your point of view, Joe, because I think I'm hearing you on the idea of like we've struggled with the same question, like what role should O&M measures play on the prescriptive pathway, and we've been struggling with that same point, which is why we wanted to have this conversation. So we appreciate your input on that. And then I do want to sort of go back to something that Cliff said a little while ago about the idea that some of these a building owner may be able to get more buy-in from tenants, because I don't know if this will sway the way that some of you feel about how we're building out the prescriptive pathway or other components of the program. So we talked to you all about going to our Office of General Counsel and sort of changing the language from alternative compliance penalty to alternative compliance payment. Now that our rules have been reviewed by the Office of the Attorney General, we have been told that we cannot call these alternative compliance payments because we can't go against what's in the statute. So rules cannot go, generally rules and regulations cannot go against what's in legislative language. So since the legislative language says alternative compliance penalties, we can't then go in the regulations and call them alternative compliance payments. And that was a decision that was sort of handed to us from our Office of Attorney General and our Office of General Counsel. So I just want to let you all know that because Cliff did mention it earlier.
Thank you. That's good to know. It's unfortunate news. I don't know if there are any future technical amendments to the law. Perhaps that could get fixed.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate news.
Maybe we can make a small technical amendment before the rules are final and they can fix it. I don't know if that's possible. But it is too bad. Katie, I think that's a request to repeat the thing you just said.
Yes. So the language in the legislation states that the building owner will be subject to alternative compliance penalties, and so that will stay as is. They will be called alternative compliance penalties.
So I do want to try to finish up our conversation on the prescriptive pathway, and maybe this is something we can take to the next meeting or offline. And so I do want to come back and just ask kind of our last question on the prescriptive path, which is, we don't have it spelled out here on the page, but and this is a probably simple question. We actually probably even put this to a quick survey in the chat as well. But I know in a lot of consensus we've talked about the prescriptive pathway on a point scale, and I think a lot of cases we've said like 20 points, where each point is equal to a savings percentage. Do folks have a sense of whether or not maybe we should be offering this as a 100-point scale, and so we have more flexibility in the ranges we can offer for points? So instead of having to complete enough measures to get to 20 points, it would be complete enough measures to get to 100 points.
That makes sense. I know LEED has run into problems like you get 1 point for bike rack. They can't give you less than 1 point. You may run into similar things where there's small things that you want to give credit for, but it would be overly generous to give a full point if you use just a 20-point system.
If you're able to give half points, quarter points, third points, or whatever, then I think a third point would be weird, but in any case, then I don't think it's an issue, and I think the fact that it adds up to 20 is nice, but if that's going to become a problem, then yeah, that greater flexibility is probably good, of having that wider range might be helpful.
It also might be, this is like pure small brain, key brain thinking on my part, but like, you know, bigger numbers mean more likely to do things. Like if I see a 5-point thing versus half a point, maybe I'm more likely to pick the 100-point scale 5-point thing rather than the 20-point scale half a point thing, because it just looks better. I don't know if anything I just said made sense, but
I'm with you, Andrew. Yeah, people like big points. It's like the case for PPR. Give people like points.
Can we do a quick thing in the chat box on that one too? Does everybody like the idea of 100 points? Do we have a little bit more flexibility?
like everyone just giving us a A+.
Look at that consensus.
Yeah, that was easy.
Getting things done.
Yes, and obviously I think, well, I guess there's the other question, which I imagine will also be a quick consensus, but do folks generally want us to disclose the methodology by which we arrive at point values for a 100-point scale?
Since it won't be so intuitive as if it was 20 points?
Yes.
Isn't the methodology, and the methodology might not be multiplied by 5?
It might be. There also might be some rounding in there. No? Alright, seems like...
I'm guessing the number of people who want to see that methodology is smaller than the number of people on this call. which is a small number.
It'll be so fun to write. Okay. That seems pretty straightforward. So that actually does bring us to the end of our slide deck. But before we move off, is there any other topics on the prescriptive path we want to cover, or thoughts or questions from any of the slides today? I quickly scroll through the chat to see if there's anything outstanding. We did have a really good active chat today. Yes, Marshall. We will have a nice methodology document.
Yeah, you sounded so sad about not writing the methodology document, so I had to put in a comment about it.
I just wanted to know if people wanted it, you know?
Andrew, I always want what you're writing. The stuff one. Moving right along. I want to go back just briefly, sort of for the record, to a point Joe made about sort of why take the prescriptive path and sort of people investing in the district and wanting certainty versus sort of, hand-holding. And I actually think the challenge we've been struggling with all along the prescriptive path is I actually think it serves both purposes for different audiences. I think there are people for whom it's about from an investment standpoint, it is really about the certainty, and that's important. But I also think there are, to use the Jewish phrase, the child who does not know how to ask the question. I think there is a useful descriptive path for that too.
Any thoughts on that from the group? I think from DOE's perspective, we do agree with that perspective as well. Sort of marrying the two concepts.
Yeah. Marshall, you're gone.
Also, totally understand if people are tired on a Tuesday and want us to move on. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to take silence as no comment to wrap things up. So wanted to give a webinar update, and Sharon, I know you're online if you want to chime in, but we've been hosting a monthly webinar session. Yours truly was featured on the September 24th. I thought it went amazing. We are posting all the webinar dates on our website. You can register them from Eventbrite. And we plan on tackling, what's our next topic? Sharon, do you know what our next topic is?
It's about the hub. It's on
there we go.
October 29th.
Perfect.
Yeah, and for the Green Building Professional Series with DOEE and DCRA, the very first one is getting ready for BEPS. So we're going to have an architect firm, energy service provider, and a building owner giving their perspective about what they've been doing in the past year to get ready for it. So we're excited about that one.
Yeah. Okay, and then what's up next? So next meeting, we wanted to quickly talk about the overall schedule. So Sharon, do you want to take this also?
Yeah, I'll take this one and the next one. So for the overall schedule, I actually put this at the end of the slide deck instead of the beginning because we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of rules and such. Things are moving behind the scenes where we think it could be a couple of weeks away or less. We'll just have to see how that goes. For the prescriptive pathway EEMs, we talked about that a little bit earlier. We need for more things to be closer to finished on the research and analysis before we can really dig into that one. And so we're getting down to the point where we have smaller conversations going on. And so if you go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. We were initially thinking about possibly holding open October 27th for kind of an open Q&A session on the rules, but we think it's going to be so close to when they may come out that it wouldn't help because nobody would have a chance to read them before we had a Q&A session. So we're thinking sometime in November we will save a task force meeting for an open Q&A session on the rules, and probably offer another public one separate from the task force meeting. So, and some of the other things on the previous slide are not going to be ready to discuss on October 27th. So what we're proposing is canceling the October 27th meeting, giving everybody a little bit of a break, and then having our next meeting on November 10th. If that sounds good with everybody, then that is the plan. And if for the November 10th topics, we just have not determined them yet because it all depends on what happens with the rules in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be able to narrow that down. So for the November 10th agenda, we will send that out and post it on our website once we get closer to that date. I think that's it for that slide. We'll just open it up for announcements.
Yes. I am just going to iterate one off the bat from Mark Bryan, who had to jump off, but he's looking for anyone who has sample template RFP language for deep building retrofit planning for an apartment building. So if anyone has any thoughts or might have that, feel free to get in contact with him. If not, just ping me in the chat or email us and we'll put you in contact. But any other announcements? Hearing none. I think we can have a little bit of our day back before we all sign off. Sharon, if you want to stop the recording, or is there anything I have to
No, I'll do that.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Andrew, for facilitating today.
Of course.